Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever and wherever you are. My name is Anna Rochelle, and today we are going to go ahead and talk about using intercept form to graph a quadratic function. So the first two problems that we're going to do are going to be pretty darn basic because in these cases, it's already in intercept form for us. So all we have to do is just solve and figure things out. The next two problems, we are going to have to get them into intercept form. So it'll be just a little bit more challenging, but no worries, we've got this. Okay, so when we graph a function like this, a couple of things that we're going to need to do. Step one, we're going to actually need to go ahead and find our x-intercepts. So I'm going to say when we're in this intercept form already, finding our x-intercepts is going to be the very first thing that we do, and it's going to be super duper easy. So the way that we find our x-intercepts is we actually just set each of the parentheses equal to 0 and then solve, right? So in order to get on x on its own, we're going to subtract 4, subtract 1, and we're going to end up with x is -4 and x is -1. So my x-intercepts are going to be -4 and -1. Done with that. Okay. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to actually find the axis of symmetry. Now, the axis of symmetry is going to be halfway in between this -4 and -1. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the formula for finding the average, for finding the mean for middle school. And we're just going to do -4 plus -1. And then we're going to divide it by 2. So, right, we're looking for the average of two numbers. Go ahead, add them, and then divide by 2 because you've only got two numbers. So this is kind of a little bit gross, but that's fine because it's -5/2. So my axis of symmetry is going to be x is -2.5. You could sometimes leave it as x is -5/2. It just depends on what you feel comfortable with and what your teacher usually says. That would be a good idea to leave it in, okay? The next thing that we're going to do is find the vertex. Now, once we have this axis of symmetry, now symmetry is just like a line straight down the middle of your face, right? You've got two eyes, one on each side of your nose, one on each side of this axis of symmetry, two ears, two eyebrows, two nostrils, two parts of your lips, right? Two cheeks, two parts of your forehead, so on and so forth. So the same business, this is exactly what this axis of symmetry is. So we've got on either side of our face, we've got all of these symmetric pieces, but we've only got one tip of the nose. We've only got one tip of our chin, right? And so this one tip of our chin right here is actually going to be the vertex of our facial parabola. So how do we find that? We actually take this -2.5 or -5/2, whichever you prefer, and we put it back into here to solve for y. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead, we're going to say, okay, I have -2.5 plus 4, and I have -2.5 plus 1. So this becomes 4 minus 2 is 2, minus 1/2 is going to be 1.5, and then this is going to be -1.5. So 1.5 and -1.5 is 3/2 times -3/2, which is -9 over, not 2, and over 4. Okay. So my vertex is going to be either -5/2, comma, -9/4, or we can write it down as -2.5, comma, -2 1/4. Either of those totally works, not an issue. Now, the next thing that we're going to do is actually graph this. So when I graph this out, I'm going to have 2 points. So point number 1 is going to be my my intercepts. So I'm going to go ahead and plot -4. I'm going to go ahead and plot -1. We're going to say -2 and -3 are there. So this is one point here. This is another point here. I know these to be my x-intercepts because I've already found them in blue. The next thing that I'm going to find is my axis of symmetry. Now I'm going to actually draw a line straight down here and hope that I'm kind of in the right place. If not, I can move it, but yours should potentially be in the right place, somewhere between -2 and -3. Then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to place my axis of symmetry on my axis of symmetry, my vertex. So I know that this is supposed to be -2.5, but this is supposed to be -1.25. So I'm going to put this as -2.25, and we're just going to call it good. And then that's it. That is my entire graph. I can go ahead and graph like this. It should be a U-shaped form, and so really that's kind of where we're at. My domain is all real numbers because I go all the way from -infinity to +infinity. And my range is y is everything is greater than or equal to this -2.25. Now, the reason why this is -2.25 is because this is actually my lowest point on my graph, and everything just kind of like jumps up from that lowest point and it continues to go up and up and up. So we're going to say it's greater than or equal to that. Okay, let's try the next one. So again, we're going to start with the very first thing. We're going to start with my x-intercepts because I've got it already in this like super duper easy format. So I'm going to have this x plus 1 is 0, and I'm going to have this x plus 2 is 0. I know I can solve these both by moving the 1 and the 2 over to the other side. So I'm going to end up with x is -1 and x is -2. My x-intercepts are -1 and -2. Done. Okay, my second step is going to be to find that axis of symmetry. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take this -1 and add this -2 and divide by 2. Yikes, my pencil went away. Okay, so now I'm going to end up with -3/2. Now again, you could leave this as x is -3/2 as your axis of symmetry, or you can go in and say x is equal to -1.5. Those are both totally acceptable. My last thing in here that I'm going to do is I'm going to find my vertex. So in order to find my vertex, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to plot both of my x's. I'm going to replace both of my x's with this -1.5. So I'm going to say, okay, 5 times -1.5 plus 1 times -1.5 plus 2. So this one is basic because I know 2 minus 1 is 1, and then minus another half is a half. Then I have this is going to be -1.5, and then I know I have this 5 is 5/1. So because there's only one negative, I know my answer is going to be negative, and I'm going to have -5/4, which is the same thing as -1 and 1/4. So my vertex could be -3/2, comma, -5/4, or you can always leave it in mixed numbers. This kind of looks like a 1, but it's a comma, -1.5, comma, -1.25. And now we're ready to graph, right? So let's say this is my graph. Here is my -1. I'm going to go, here is my -2, here is my -3, just to make life a little bit easier so that we can graph things a little bit better. I'm going to move this guy over quite a bit. I know that somewhere in between my -1 and -2 is this, oh yikes, that's terrible, is this axis of symmetry. I also know that I have to actually graph my x-intercepts. And then I also know that I have to graph my vertex, and my vertex can be somewhere here. And so options are, you can just go ahead and label it exactly as is. Go ahead and put this dot here and then go ahead and graph. Now, again, we're looking at the very similar kind of domain and range. My domain is going to be all real numbers. My range is going to be y is everything that's above or equal to this -1.25. Okay, let's take a look at the next one. So again, the very first thing that we're going to do is not find our x-intercepts because this is not in intercept form. So we want to make sure that we get it into intercept form. And the way that we do that is we actually go in and factor it. So we know when we factor, we have to find the factors of my first term and the factors of my last term that add up to this middle term in here when we multiply it all the way through. So in this case, my factors of 14 are going to be 1 and 14, and then 2 and 7. Now the 2 and the 7 are the only two numbers that are going to add up to 9. So I'm going to say we're going to add 2 and add 7. We're going to set it equal to 0. And then we're going to look for our x-intercepts. So x plus 2 is 0 and x plus 7 is 0. That means my intercepts are -2 and -7. So here's -2 and -7. Now, my second thing can be my axis of symmetry, right? And it probably should be. We can continue to do the same thing that we've done before, -2 plus -7, divide that by 2, end up with -9/2. So that's the same thing as -4.5. Or we can actually use the axis of symmetry formula, which is -b/2a. So in this particular case, my a is 1, because that's right in front of my x squared. My b is 9, and my c is 14, but we don't really use it, so it's not really relevant. So now in here, I'm going to end up with -9/2 times 1, which is exactly this bit here, right? This -9/2, which is the same thing as -4.5. So my axis of symmetry is either -9/2, or my axis of symmetry is -4.5. Now, you can do either method, you'll get the same answer. It just depends on whatever you're more comfortable with. And then the last bit that we're going to do in here is we're going to go ahead and we're going to find the vertex before we graph. And so the vertex, we want to make sure that we take these numbers and plop them back into the original equation. Now, options for plopping them back into the original equation, we can actually plop them back into the black equation that I've written originally, or we can go in and plop them into the factored form. I like putting them into the factored form because they're a little easier for me. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to say, okay, -4.5 plus 2. And then the same thing as -4.5 plus 7. So in here, I'm going to be at -2.5. That's a weird looking one. 7 minus 4 is 3. 3 minus another half is 2.5. So I know I'm going to do 2.5 times 2.5, which is the same thing as -5/2 times regular 5/2, which is -25/4. And I know that becomes -6.25. So again, we can say our vertex is -9/2, -25/4. Or we can say that it is -4.5, -6.25. Now, when we are graphing these, they're not so terrible if we just go in and we say, okay, here is -4.5, here is -2, here is -7. So long as we're kind of in the same boat of where we are, right? And then here we're going to put in -6.25. So long as we are in a place where we are, what's the word? Evenly spacing, I guess, evenly spacing our tick marks on our graph, I think we should be just fine. In this case, this is what my graph would look like. So we know that the domain is going to be, again, all real numbers because I'm going from negative to positive infinity. And my range is going to be y is greater than or equal to -6.25. Okay, last problem. So in this case, my first thing that I actually want to do is I want to go ahead and factor it so that I can find my x-intercepts. So before I factor this, I'm actually going to divide everything by -2 so that I can get smaller numbers to work with. So I'm going to end up with x squared plus 2x minus 15. And I know my factors for 15 are 1 and 15, which doesn't really quite add up to 2. And 3 and 5, which does actually, in fact, add up to 2. So perfect for us. So we're going to end up with -2, and then I'm going to have 2 sets of parentheses. X times x is x squared. And then plus 5 minus 3. I know that it's plus 5 because I want a positive 2. And now I'm going to set each of these guys equal to 0. And so I'm going to end up with x is -5 and x is regular 3. So when I go in and graph -5 and positive 3, I'm going to have one on each side of the axis of the y-intercept. Now my axis of symmetry, I can go in and I can do the same thing. I know that I have 5 units on the left-hand side and 3 units on the right-hand side of my graph. So for example, here is where 3 would be, here is where -5 would be. This distance here is 5. This distance here is 3. So I know I have a total distance between the two of 8 units. And so my 8 units divided into 2 equal parts is 4 units. So I'm going to travel 4 units this way and 4 units that way to -1. And this is going to be my axis of symmetry. So my axis of symmetry is -1. Now this time is really nice because I've got such an easy number to work with. I guess we save the best for last. And then I've got -1 minus 3. So I'm going to end up with -2 times 4 times -4. So I know the two negatives will cancel out and become a positive. 4 times 4 is 16 times 2 is 32. So I'm going to put 32 up here. I know that it's not quite exactly evenly spaced, but on your end, you're going to want to make it as evenly spaced as possible. So number 3 is my vertex, and my vertex is -1, positive 32. Now, one of the things that I do want you to notice here is that in here, my vertex is actually above my x-axis, and my 2 x-intercepts are on the x-axis. So what's going to happen is my graph is going to kind of open downwards. Now, one of the reasons why I chose this problem is because it does open downwards. So it's a little bit different than what we normally had. And one of the reasons why that's the case is because I have a negative in front of my x squared. That negative means that I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to have a sad face. And so it does not change my domain. My domain is still going to be all real numbers. My domain for any quadratic function is always going to be all real numbers. My range, however, is not going to be greater than this 32. In fact, it's going to be everything that's less than or equal to this 32, because 32 is now my uppermost point versus my lowermost point. Okay, and that's it. We've graphed the function, we've identified the vertex, the axis of symmetry, the x-intercepts, and we've stated the domain and range for all of these. I hope that this was super helpful, and I will see you in another video. Bye.